June 6, 1944, 9:45 in the morning. The fate of Europe currently hangs on a single terrifying decision: to knock or not to knock. While 150,000 Allied troops are storming the beaches of Normandy in a storm of fire and steel, the German High Command is frozen in absolute terror outside a quiet bedroom door in the Bavarian Alps. Inside sleeps Adolf Hitler, heavily sedated and oblivious to the collapse of his empire. Outside stands General Alfred Jodl, his hand raised, trembling, paralyzed by the knowledge that waking the dictator could spark a rage more dangerous than the invasion itself. Jodl lowered his hand, choosing silence over survival. He was the chief of operations, a man who moved armies on maps, yet he was reduced to a frightened subordinate by the atmosphere of the Berghof. He knew the reports had been screaming over the teletypes since dawn, paratroopers dropping in the thousands, an armada of 5,000 ships blackening the horizon. But the rigid, feudal structure of the Nazi command meant that the only man authorized to release the vital Panzer reserves was currently in a chemical coma induced by Dr. Theodor Morell's powerful barbiturates. This was the fatal flaw of the dictatorship exposed in real time. While the beaches of Omaha and Utah were being painted red with blood, the German response was bottlenecked by a sleeping pill, granting the Allies the one thing they needed most: time. When the heavy timber door finally opened and the dictator emerged, groggy and shuffling, the machinery of the German High Command could finally reboot after hours of catastrophic downtime. Jodl broke the news that Fortress Europe was under attack, bracing himself for the legendary explosion of fury. Instead, Hitler stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment before his face contorted into a strange, predatory satisfaction. He famously remarked that the news was excellent because now, finally, the enemy was where he could destroy them, declaring with absolute confidence that they would not leave the beaches alive. This reaction was not born of bravery, but of a profound detachment from reality, a delusion fueled by years of intuition that had slowly replaced military logic. Hitler walked to the large window overlooking the majestic, peaceful peaks of the Alps, his hands clasped behind his back, and dismissed the monumental scale of the Normandy landings as a transparent deception. He was absolutely convinced that the chaos in Normandy was merely a diversionary feint designed to lure the German reserves away from the real target, which his gut told him was the Pas de Calais. This obsession was the direct result of Operation Fortitude, the Allies' masterclass in deception, where they had created an entire phantom army group in southeastern England using inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic to convince German intelligence that General George Patton was poised to strike the narrowest point of the Channel. Hitler's belief in this phantom threat was so absolute that he viewed the thousands of ships and men hitting Normandy as sacrificial pawns in a massive bluff. Consequently, as the critical morning hours ticked away, the golden hours that determined the success of an amphibious assault, Hitler refused to issue the order that Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel were practically screaming for. He refused to release the Panzer reserves, specifically the powerful 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and the Panzer Lehr Division. These elite armored units, equipped with Panther and Tiger tanks superior to anything the Allies possessed, sat idling in their camouflage positions under the trees, their crews playing cards and waiting for an order that remained frozen in the Bavarian atmosphere. The perspective from the German headquarters in Paris, commanded by the aging Field Marshal von Rundstedt, was one of apoplectic frustration and dawning horror. Von Rundstedt, an old-school Prussian officer who privately held the Bohemian corporal in contempt, understood the fundamental principles of mobile warfare. An enemy beachhead must be crushed immediately before it can consolidate heavy weaponry. He paced his office in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, barking into telephones and demanding authorization to move the tanks, only to be told repeatedly by Jodl's staff that the Führer was thinking or eating or taking a walk and could not be disturbed. This bureaucratic paralysis meant that the finest striking force in Western Europe was effectively neutralized not by enemy fire, but by their own chain of command. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the celebrated Desert Fox tasked with defending the Atlantic Wall, was living his own personal nightmare. He had chosen this specific weekend to return to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, convinced by meteorological reports that the weather was too poor for an invasion. Rommel was hundreds of miles away from his headquarters when the phone rang, shattering his domestic tranquility with the news that the invasion front had opened. He immediately began a frantic, high-speed drive back to France, his staff car tearing through the German countryside. But he knew with sickening certainty that he would arrive too late to influence the critical first 24 hours. Rommel had always argued that the enemy must be defeated on the water's edge, and now he was watching his prophecy of defeat unfold from the helpless interior of a speeding automobile. Back in Normandy, the situation for the German defenders was rapidly deteriorating from a manageable tactical crisis into a strategic catastrophe. While the Americans at Omaha Beach were initially pinned down and slaughtered in droves, the relentless pressure of wave after wave of infantry, supported by point-blank naval gunfire from destroyers scraping their hulls on the sand, began to crack the German defenses. The 352nd Infantry Division, which had fought with ferocious tenacity, was running low on ammunition and seeing their bunkers pulverized one by one, constantly looking over their shoulders for the Panzer support that had been promised but never arrived. Without the counterattack by the armored reserves, the German infantry was left to die in static positions, overwhelmed by the sheer material weight of the Allied assault. By the early afternoon, Hitler had finally dressed and composed himself, appearing at the daily situation conference with an air of arrogant calm that baffled the few rational officers remaining in his inner circle. He looked at the maps, which were already outdated by the speed of the Allied advance, and continued to insist that the Normandy landings were a trap, pointing to the lack of a major port capture as evidence that this could not be the main effort. He speculated that the Allies wanted him to strip the defenses of Calais so they could launch the decisive blow there, a theory that aligned perfectly with the deception plan fed to him by British intelligence. This confirmation bias was impenetrable. Every report of heavy fighting in Normandy was interpreted as the enemy trying too hard to sell the deception, reinforcing his decision to keep the 15th Army pinned down in the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. It was not until late in the afternoon on June 6th, the window for a decisive counterattack having slammed shut, Hitler finally, grudgingly, agreed to release a portion of the reserves. However, the order was convoluted and hesitant, releasing only the 12th SS and Panzer Lehr divisions, while keeping the bulk of the strategic reserve held back for the imaginary second invasion. Furthermore, because the order came so late in the day, these units had to begin their approach march during the lingering daylight hours or wait for dusk, exposing them to the absolute tyranny of Allied air superiority. The skies over Normandy belonged entirely to the British and Americans, with thousands of fighter bombers, the dreaded Yabos, prowling for any movement on the French road network. The result of moving the Panzers in daylight or twilight was predictable and devastating. Columns of tanks and trucks that should have been smashing into the Allied flanks were instead forced to crawl along back roads, hiding in hedgerows to avoid incineration from above. The Panzer Lehr Division, an elite unit that could have turned the tide at Omaha or Gold Beach, lost vital vehicles and experienced delays that rendered them ineffective for the immediate counterthrust Rommel had envisioned. The terrifying efficiency of the Allied tactical air forces meant that German mobility, the hallmark of their blitzkrieg doctrine, had been completely negated, forcing them to fight a static war of attrition they could not possibly win. That evening, as the sun set over the smoldering ruins of the Normandy coast, the Allies had successfully landed over 156,000 men, establishing a disjointed but viable perimeter across 5 beachheads. The frantic reports from the German 7th Army commander, Friedrich Dollmann, describing the endless stream of enemy reinforcements, were met with indifference at the Berghof, where dinner was being served in a surreal atmosphere of normalcy. Hitler sat with his secretaries and adjutants, picking at his vegetarian meal and monologuing about the cultural inferiority of the Americans and the impending collapse of the British Empire, treating the day's events as a minor tactical annoyance rather than the death knell of the Third Reich. He spoke about his plans for rebuilding the Opera House in Linz and the grand boulevards of Berlin, effectively retreating into a fantasy world where his will alone dictated the course of history. Across the table, aides who had seen the raw teletype reports sat in stunned silence, possessing the knowledge that the Atlantic Wall had been breached and that the enemy was ashore with tanks and artillery. They knew that the window to push the Allies back into the sea had existed only for a few fleeting hours that morning. Hours that had been squandered while the Supreme Commander slept and his subordinates cowered in fear. The psychological disconnect was total. Hitler believed he was luring the enemy into a kill zone, while in reality, he was allowing a massive industrial power to establish a logistical hub on the continent of Europe. As night fell on June 6, the Allies began the miraculous engineering feat of towing massive concrete caissons across the channel to build artificial mulberry harbors, ensuring that the flow of supplies would continue regardless of whether they captured a port. This technological marvel was completely outside the scope of Hitler's imagination. He could not conceive that an enemy would bring their own harbors with them, further cementing his belief that Normandy must be a diversion because it lacked deep-water port facilities. The darkness covered the frantic consolidation of the Allied positions, soldiers digging foxholes in the French soil, terrified of the German counterattack that they assumed must be coming, unaware that the German tanks were still miles away, paralyzed by confusion and air attacks. The following day, June 7th, brought no clarity to the Wolf's Lair, only a deepening of the delusion as Hitler continued to scour the intelligence reports for signs of the real invasion at Calais. He obsessed over the location of Patton, convinced that the American general was waiting in England to lead the main thrust, falling victim to the fear of a reputation that the Allies had carefully cultivated. This fixation meant that even as the Battle of Normandy raged with increasing ferocity, crucial German infantry divisions remained guarding empty beaches in the Pas-de-Calais, effectively quarantined from the war by the mind of their leader. The strategic blindness was so profound that even when Rommel finally arrived at his headquarters and began trying to cobble together a defense, he found his hands tied by restrictions on troop movement that emanated directly from Hitler's map room. The failure to react on D-Day was not merely a tactical error, but a symptom of the systemic rot within the Nazi leadership, where reality was filtered through the ideological lens of a single man. By refusing to accept that the enemy had outsmarted him, Hitler condemned his armies in the West to a battle of annihilation, forcing them to hold ground that could not be held against an opponent with infinite resources. The panzers that finally reached the front days later were thrown into battle piecemeal, fed into the meat grinder of the Normandy bocage, where their superior range and optics were neutralized by the close-quarters fighting of the hedgerows. The opportunity for a decisive armored strike had evaporated with the morning mist of June 6, leaving the German army to fight a desperate defensive struggle that would end 11 months later in the rubble of Berlin. 10 days after the invasion began, the strategic paralysis gripping the German high command manifested physically in a concrete bunker near Margable, France, where Hitler arrived for his one and only visit to the Western Front on June 17th. The meeting was intended to be a council of war between the Führer and his field marshals, Rommel and von Rundstedt, but the atmosphere inside the Volksschlucht tomb complex was thick with accusation and denial. Rommel, looking haggard and desperate, tried to puncture Hitler's bubble of optimism by presenting a stark mathematical assessment of the situation. The enemy had absolute air superiority, their artillery fire was inexhaustible, and the German infantry was being pulverized faster than it could be replaced. He spoke with the blunt honesty of a man who had seen his soldiers dying in the hedgerows, pleading for a strategic withdrawal to the line of the River Seine to escape the range of naval gunfire and shorten the defensive front. Hitler listened with mounting irritation, his fingers drumming on the map table, before dismissing the tactical reality with a wave of his hand and launching into a monologue about the new wonder weapons that would soon turn the tide. He spoke feverishly about the V-1 flying bombs that had just begun raining down on London, convinced that this terror campaign would break the British morale and force them out of the war, leaving the Americans isolated on the continent. Von Rundstedt, the aristocratic Prussian who viewed these unguided missiles as useless terror tactics rather than military assets, realized with a sinking heart that the Supreme Commander was no longer fighting a military campaign, but a psychological one, pitting his willpower against the industrial output of the United States. The meeting ended abruptly when a stray V-1 malfunctioned and exploded nearby, sending the dictator scurrying back to his car and speeding away toward Germany, never to return to the front lines he commanded. Following this disastrous conference, the disconnect between the orders emanating from the Wolf's Lair and the reality in the Normandy bocage widened into a chasm that swallowed entire divisions. The terrain of the bocage, a centuries-old patchwork of small fields surrounded by thick, root-tangled earth banks topped with dense hedges, transformed the battle into a claustrophobic nightmare of ambushes and close-quarters slaughter. German paratroopers and SS infantry turned every field into a fortress, fighting with a tactical brilliance that terrified the Allies. But they were fighting a war of attrition where every loss was permanent. While the Americans could replace a destroyed Sherman tank within hours, a knocked-out German Panther was gone forever, its crew likely dead or captured, and its replacement stuck somewhere on a rail line bombed into oblivion by the Allied air forces. The hold-at-all-costs order meant that German units were forbidden from maneuvering, the very skill that had made the Wehrmacht the most feared army in the world, reducing them to static targets for the overwhelming Allied firepower. When General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, commander of Panzer Group West, dared to suggest a tactical withdrawal to pull his tanks out of the range of naval artillery, Hitler relieved him of command instantly, replacing him with a more pliable subordinate. This purge of independent thought signaled to every officer in the West that tactical competence was secondary to blind obedience, creating a culture where generals lied in their reports to avoid the Führer's wrath, painting a picture of stability on maps while their fronts were actually collapsing. By July, the battle had become a relentless meat grinder, and the German army was bleeding to death while Hitler obsessed over maps that bore no relation to the cratered moonscape of Normandy. The logistical strangulation was absolute. Fuel was so scarce that tanks were often towed to the front by oxen, and ammunition convoys were forced to crawl through the night, hiding in forests at the first hint of dawn to escape the prowling Jabos. The psychological toll of the air supremacy was devastating, as German soldiers wrote home describing the sensation of being watched by an all-seeing eye that could rain death upon them the moment they stepped into the open. Yet in Berlin, the propaganda machine churned out stories of imminent victory, while Hitler shifted phantom divisions around his map table, ordering counterattacks by units that had long since ceased to exist as cohesive fighting forces. Then, on July 17th, the war claimed its most famous casualty when Erwin Rommel's staff car was strafed by a British Spitfire near St. Foy de Montgomery, sending the vehicle careening off the road and fracturing the field marshal's skull. The loss of Rommel removed the one commander who possessed both the tactical genius to manage the defense and the political stature to potentially challenge Hitler's suicidal orders. His replacement, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, arrived to find a situation that was irretrievable, inheriting a command structure that was rotting from the head down. Von Kluge quickly realized what Rommel had known for weeks. The front was brittle, stretched to the breaking point, and facing an enemy that was growing stronger with every tide. 3 days later, on July 20th, the simmering discontent within the German military boiled over into a desperate act of violence that would seal the fate of the Western Front. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg detonated a briefcase bomb inside the conference room at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, an attempt to decapitate the Nazi regime and save Germany from total destruction. Miraculously, the heavy oak table shielded Hitler from the blast, leaving him singed, deafened, and shaken, but alive, and more dangerously, vindicated in his darkest suspicions. He emerged from the smoking ruins of the briefing hut, not with a sense of mortality, but with a messianic conviction that Providence had saved him to complete his mission, and that the struggles of the army were solely the result of treason by the aristocratic officer corps. The failed assassination attempt unleashed a wave of paranoia that paralyzed the German command structure at the exact moment it needed maximum flexibility to survive the coming storm. Hitler saw traitors in every shadow, instituting a brutal purge that saw thousands of officers arrested, tortured, and executed, while National Socialist guidance officers, political commissars, were embedded in units to ensure ideological purity. Generals were terrified to make even minor tactical adjustments without written permission, fearing that a retreat of a few hundred meters would be interpreted as complicity in the plot. The command paralysis that had delayed the Panzer release on D-Day was now institutionalized, freezing the Wehrmacht in place just as the Americans were winding up the knockout blow. On July 25th, the Americans unleashed Operation Cobra, a massive breakout attempt west of Saint-Lô, preceded by a carpet bombing campaign that obliterated the elite Panzer Division. Thousands of tons of high explosives turned the landscape into a lunar wasteland, burying German tanks and infantry alive, and opening a breach in the line that General George Patton's Third Army surged through with unstoppable momentum. The static defense Hitler had insisted upon shattered like glass. There were no reserves left to plug the gap because they had all been committed to the front line to hold every inch. American tanks raced into the open French countryside, tearing into the German rear, cutting supply lines, and creating chaos that no amount of willpower could contain. Faced with this catastrophe, a rational commander would have ordered an immediate general retreat to the Seine to save the army. But Hitler, studying the maps in his bunker 2,000 kilometers away, saw not a disaster, but an opportunity. Against the advice of every single general in the West, he ordered Operation Luttich, a massive counterattack toward Mortain, intended to cut off Patton's spearheads and reach the Sea of Avranches. It was a fantasy maneuver, requiring exhausted Panzer divisions to attack without air cover into the teeth of the American advance. When the attack launched on August 7th, it ran headlong into a wall of American anti-tank fire and Typhoon rocket attacks, stalling within hours and leaving the German tanks exposed and burning in the summer sun. This failed counterattack did more than just waste tanks. It pushed the German 7th Army deep into a pocket, creating a deadly trap as the Americans swung underneath them and the British and Canadians pressed down from the north. This was the Falaise Pocket, a killing zone where 100,000 German soldiers were squeezed into a shrinking corridor of death, hammered by artillery and relentless airstrikes. Inside the pocket, discipline collapsed into sheer survival instinct as burning trucks, dead horses, and shattered vehicles clogged the narrow roads, while pilots above reported the stench of death rising thousands of feet into the air. Still, Hitler refused to authorize a breakout, insisting that the position be held, condemning his own soldiers to slaughter for the sake of lines on a map that no longer reflected reality. By the time the permission to retreat was finally given, it was too late for the heavy equipment. The remnants of the once proud Panzer armies abandoned their tanks and fled on foot across the Seine, leaving behind the wreckage of the German military machine in France. Paris was liberated on August 25th, not amidst a titanic battle of annihilation, as Hitler had ordered, commanding the city be left as a field of ruins, but largely intact, as the German commander von Choltitz disobeyed the order, recognizing the futility of destroying history for a lost cause. The liberation of the French capital symbolized the end of Hitler's dominance in the West, a dominance that had been thrown away in the lethargic morning hours of June 6th. The retreat to the German border in September 1944 was a spectacle of disintegration, a ragged column of defeated men moving east, constantly harried by the resistance in the Allied air forces. The fortress Europe that propaganda had claimed was impregnable had fallen in less than 3 months, not because the German soldier lacked courage, but because his leadership lacked reason. Yet, even as the Allies approached the Siegfried Line in the sacred soil of the Reich, Hitler did not seek peace. Instead, he withdrew further into his fantasy, planning one last great gamble that would supposedly reverse the entire course of the war. He began stripping the Eastern Front of vital tank reserves, pulling them away from the defense against the Red Army to build a strike force for the Ardennes. This resulted in the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, a condensed replay of the Normandy failure, a brilliant initial surprise that achieved tactical gains but was doomed by logistical shortages and Allied air superiority. It was the final spasm of the dying regime, wasting the last reserves of German manpower and armor in an offensive that had zero strategic chance of success. When it failed, the road to Berlin was left wide open, and the destruction of Germany itself became inevitable. The cities of the Reich were pulverized from the air, the Soviets poured across the Oder, and the Americans crossed the Rhine, all while the dictator moved non-existent armies around his map table in the damp squalor of the Führer bunker. In those final days of April 1945, as the Soviet artillery hammered the government district of Berlin, Hitler continued to rail against the betrayal of the army, never grasping that the true betrayal was his own abandonment of reality. He screamed at his generals about the failure of Army Group Steiner to launch a counterattack, unaware or unwilling to accept that Steiner existed mostly on paper, a collection of stragglers and boys with no weapons. The journey that had begun with a sleeping pill and a hesitant knock at the Berghof ended with a bullet in the brain in a concrete tomb, leaving behind a continent in ruins and millions of dead. The hesitation of Alfred Jodl on the morning of D-Day was not just a moment of bureaucratic fear, it was the defining moment where the cult of personality finally strangled the competence of the state. Ultimately, the Second World War in the West was decided not just by the bravery of the boys on Omaha Beach or the industrial might of Detroit, but by the colossal arrogance of a man who believed he could bend reality to his will. The refusal to wake a sleeping tyrant bought the Allies the beachhead. The refusal to accept the truth bought them the continent. History is often written as a clash of armies, but in the summer of 1944, it was determined by the silence in a hallway, the fear in a general's heart, and the profound tragic sleep of reason. If Hitler had been awake and released the Panzer reserves immediately on the morning of June 6th, do you think the D-Day landings would have failed? Or was Allied air superiority too strong to overcome? Let me know your analysis in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.